bonfire night, November the 5th, the Gunpowder Plot. Of course, Guy Fawkes was caught. His plan to kill the king and all his lords failed. It didn't happen. But what if the gunpowder had gone off in this cellar beneath Parliament that dark day 400 years ago? Would it have worked? Well, no one has ever been sure until now. We are going to light the fuse that Fawkes didn't and make history. The 5th of November, 1605. After months of plotting, Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators are about to blow up the English Parliament. Luckily for James I and all his lords, they got found out. But what if they hadn't? Would their plot have worked? Was there enough gunpowder? Would it have gone off? Would they have killed the king? 400 years on, I'm going to try and solve these mysteries by building a full-size House of Lords, filling it with the right amount of gunpowder, and carrying out Fawkes' failed plot in one of the biggest gunpowder blasts ever. To start, I need to find the building Guy Fawkes was going to blow. Welcome to Westminster, the Houses of Parliament, Big Ben, some of the most famous landmarks in Britain, and the buildings that spring to mind the moment we think of the gunpowder plot and the infamous conspiracy to blow up Parliament. But in actual fact, this Westminster, apart perhaps from some of the dodgy goings-on inside, has very little to do with that Westminster of 400 years ago. With its spires, ornate carvings and gilded chambers, it looks like a medieval Gothic palace. But it's not. It's a glorious imitation, built in Victorian times, more than 250 years after Guy Fawkes was around. My first mission was to find the original Palace of Westminster, the House of Lords that Fawkes tried to destroy. So it is quite difficult. I needed help, so I found someone who knew Old Westminster like the back of their hand.
In the 17th century, it would have looked very different. This would have been a passageway going down to the river and a boat jetty. Approximately along this line here would have been where the House of Lords was.
What?
Yeah, it was demolished in the early 19th century by Sir John Soane, who was given the task of providing a new entrance to the House of Lords.
So it's not here anymore, I can't see it?
No.
It is, in fact, a car park.
It would.
Disappointing. It's a bit like finding your childhood home has been demolished to make a petrol station. It wasn't the start I'd hoped for, but what Simon did have was a 17th century illustration. Simon had used this drawing to calculate exactly where the building had been, but it didn't have the precise technical information I would need to build a replica. I left Simon with the task of unearthing the essential details, while I went in search of a place to blow up a building. Now, obviously, what I'm trying to do here isn't exactly, you know, an everyday event. There's going to be a very big bang, which might upset people, and probably an awful lot of mess afterwards. So I can't just pitch up at a farmer's field and do it. But I have found somewhere, probably the only place in Europe, remote enough and with the facilities to actually do this. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to actually tell you where it is. Hello there.
Afternoon, sir. You got any ID, please?
Yes, I can, actually. There you go. Just the bags and stuff there. There you go. Let's rack up the engine.
There's been a search. Have you signed here?
What I can tell you is that it's somewhere in Cumbria, and it's seen a fair bit of testing before.
001, flight information, report ready, game on.
It's a 21st century electronic warfare range, the busiest in Europe. I felt a bit daft saying I wanted to build a large old medieval hall here, but at least they understood the bit about wanting to blow it up. By the time I'd got through the understandably tight security, my construction team were raring to get on with the job. They'd already picked a well-out-of-the-way test pad.
This is remote. Remote enough for what we want to do anyway, I think.
Having located a safe place to build, the team began marking out the footprint of Fawkes' House of Lords.
We just need to move everything 2 metres that way. That's fine. We'll see when we put the tape on.
Then we had a breakthrough back at the Westminster Archives.
Simon has done his research and he's come up with absolute gold dust. Original plans made back in the 18th century when they were trying to work out ways of heating the royals, lords and dignitaries in the House of Lords. So they're the perfect blueprint for our construction team to work from.
It was just the information we needed if we were to successfully build a structurally exact replica. But the old construction drawings revealed two surprises about medieval buildings. Turns out the cellar wasn't a cellar at all. It was called an undercroft, a ground floor storeroom. This was where Guy Fawkes planned to blow his gunpowder. And what's more, the walls of some important buildings back then were not made of just stone, but rubble mixed with mortar. That's solid medieval concrete. For our experiment to be accurate, this undercroft is what we had to recreate. But in 1605, how did the old House of Lords fit in? What buildings surrounded it? Today's London is a mass of concrete and high-rise buildings, but back then, Guy Fawkes' Westminster was just a small parish in the middle of fields. Inside it was a jumble of cramped back streets, a warren of oak-beamed houses surrounding the Abbey, and of course, the House of Lords. I started to wonder about the men who planned to destroy this, and in whose footsteps I was following. Who were the gunpowder plotters? There were 5 plotters at the heart of the conspiracy. Robert Catesby, the mastermind. Charisma and intellect were his main weapons. Thomas Winter, the wheeler-dealer. Catesby's best mate, Winter, had cash and connections. Thomas Percy, the insider. Percy had family in high places. John Wright, the swordsman. He was one of the finest blades in England. And Guy Fawkes, a soldier and explosives specialist. And most importantly, unknown to the English spy network. Fawkes was the man who planned the giant gunpowder blast, the one that I am trying to recreate. And it's here that we've got to conduct our not-so-little experiment. The building will have to be 9 meters wide and 21 meters long.
There'll be over 1 kilometre of scaffolding used just to hold the upper story together. It is big, very big. In fact, I'm not sure we haven't bitten off more than we can chew.
That's lovely.
My quest to carry out Guy Fawkes' foiled plot is underway.
Here at our safely out-of-the-way test site, construction work has finally started. But there's a very long way to go. And meanwhile, I've got to go and get hold of some gunpowder.
Not just any old gunpowder, but the same that Fawkes would have used.
I've come here to meet a man who is a specialist in his field. In this field, in fact. Sydney. Yeah. Hiya.
In these unlikely surroundings is explosives maestro Sydney Alford. Amongst other things, Sydney is one of the country's leading bomb disposal experts.
We're going this way.
Excellent. But you know what we want to do. Full-size, replica House of Lords, gunpowder, blow it up. You've had time to have a think.
Yep.
And?
I thought.
OK.
And I think we can do it.
Sydney had already carried out research into the gunpowder used in the 1600s. Turned out there were 2 types available, a fast musket gunpowder or a slower burning cannon powder. There's no way of knowing which one Guy Fawkes used, so Sydney wanted to work out if they differed. After a bunch of tests with both small and large charges, he had the answer.
If you're using a large quantity of either of those powders to blow up a large building, it really wouldn't make much difference which. The thing is, how much gunpowder did Guy Fawkes intend to use?
Yeah.
We know from the records that 36 barrels of gunpowder were received.
Brilliant. So we know how much there is.
Alas, if there were only one size of barrel, we would.
We don't know how big the barrels were.
However, the gunpowder in its barrels was taken for safekeeping to the Tower of London, and the chap there who received it recorded it, and he said 1,800 weight.
Brilliant.
So, there we have it.
So we know. How much is 1,800 weight?
You really want to know?
Yes, I do. What, have you got it already?
Sort of.
Well, what's in there? Gunpowder?
No.
Sydney's come up with a rather unusual way to demonstrate 1 metric ton of gunpowder. He's rustled up something like it, but thankfully a little less explosive.
Right. And that's... We've got to get this much gunpowder.
This much gunpowder, yep.
Yeah.
Sydney revealed that if the grain were gunpowder, I was standing in enough for 100,000 fireworks. That would be a very, very big bang.
Better find a broom or something, I suppose. OK, we've started on the building and we're on the trail of the gunpowder. But there's one more thing. We burn him on the bonfire. We know he was going to light the fuse. But who was this guy? The problem with Fawkes is he's a bit of a man of mystery. There are no genuine portraits, no authentic descriptions. The first thing we do know about him for sure is the church where he was baptised. It was a small, modest building, no frills, not very grand. Yeah, not York Minster, but this, St Michael le Belfry, where at 3 days old, in the shadow of the Minster, Guy Fawkes was welcomed into the world, a good Protestant soul in a Protestant country. Now, though, you can send your auntie a postcard from York featuring Guy Fawkes' entry in the baptismal register. And you can even sleep in the room he was supposedly born in the Guy Fawkes Hotel. And you can even drink a gunpowder plot cocktail in Guido's Bar and Cafe. What I want to know is what turned a good Protestant boy into a very angry young man. As Guy grew up, religious persecution was all around. Discrimination against the Catholic Church had been rife since Henry VIII split from Rome. His daughter, Elizabeth I, was even more ruthless to the Catholics. In Guy Fawkes' hometown of York, priests were outlawed and gruesome killings created Catholic martyrs. Just imagine how witnessing those atrocities might have affected the young Guy. The next thing we do know for sure is that he left town and went to Europe to join the army. Not the English Protestant army, the Spanish Catholic army. 10 years before the plot, Fawkes was in Europe playing with gunpowder. Not always successfully.
No, when I say run, you run. I'm sure it was that fuse.
But whilst in the army, he was picking up a trade, demolition, and his speciality was using the super weapon of the day, gunpowder.
I'm sliding it in the second level, aren't we?
Back on the test site, our House of Lords was now becoming a reality.
This is stage 2, heavy metal. What we've got is shuttering, these huge steel plates. They basically make an enormous jelly mould into which we pour concrete to form the massive stone walls of the undercroft. Then set into that concrete is scaffolding. That'll support the roof and the walls of the main chamber on the floor above. So very soon we begin the enormous task of shipping in 650 tons of concrete to cast this beast in stone.
Whilst the framework was taking shape and the construction team rang around for enough concrete, I decided to find out about the man the plotters planned to murder. When Queen Elizabeth I died childless, the crown passed to her distant cousin, King James of Scotland. James I was a contradiction. Some say he was cunning, idle, and the most conceited man on earth.
And who might this be?
But he was a good father, and for a while he tried to be the master politician, keeping both Protestants and Catholics happy.
Handsome.
But in time he would be forced by the rich Protestants, who funded the royal purse, to denounce the Catholics. And so he wrote a speech which was to outrage the plotters.
And as for the papists now in this realm, whilst I would be sorry to punish their bodies for the errors of their minds, they should not think it lawful daily to increase their numbers
and strength in this kingdom.
For Catholics like Robert Catesby, the King's speech meant more than just persecution. There was talk of excommunicating all of them. They wouldn't be able to marry, own property, or leave wills. There'd be no protection from the law. The state wouldn't even recognise their existence. It was a living death. Drastic times called for drastic measures.
So at last the truth. And only one solution remains. Deliver the king back to hell.
So the plot was hatched and the countdown to annihilate Parliament had begun. Unfortunately, our countdown had ground to a complete standstill. The structural engineers were telling us that to give our walls the same strength as medieval ones, we'd have to fill the gap between the giant steel panels in one go. And getting that much concrete all at once was proving to be almost impossible.
It turns out there isn't a supplier in Cumbria big enough to provide the concrete we need to pour the walls. 650 tonnes. That's about 75 truckloads in a day.
At first, this seemed about as bad as it could get. But then a call from Sydney threatened to put a halt to everything.
Really?
Turns out Sydney had tried all of his British contacts, and none could rustle up enough gunpowder for our test.
And you think it could be that difficult? Oh boy, I've just had a very interesting telephone conversation with Sydney. He's very pleased with his gunpowder experiments. They've gone very well so far. It's getting hold of the stuff. A little bit of it, the fireworks, easy. A metric ton of gunpowder, big problem, huge. And that's bad, because no gunpowder, no experiment.
My plan to carry out Guy Fawkes' failed plot had stalled.
With a shortage of concrete in Cumbria and no gunpowder in the UK, things are not looking too good right now. But Sydney, at least for one, is not letting it get him down, because he says he's had a great idea.
Sydney widened his search for gunpowder and got wind of a factory in Spain. Thorough as always, he needed to visit it to check the quality of the ingredients to ensure our experiment stayed authentic. The trouble was, he didn't know exactly where he was going.
Where is this factory, Sydney?
Ah,
Which
well, I
is
didn't
somewhere
know
in
that in my
Spain. Look,
geography
that's
book.
not even a road, it's a
No,
track.
but I go around this bend.
Well, you said that before.
Well, I don't want you to go straight across the bend. I'm
just staying on the
Okay.
road. Look, that's a cattle grid now, so that's telling me we're
no.
somewhere in farmland.
Haven't we seen this cattle grid before?
For Guy Fawkes, getting his gunpowder was relatively easy. At the start of the 1600s, there was lots on the black market. On the 20th of May 1604, the 5 conspirators gathered, relaxed in the knowledge that Guy Fawkes, their explosives expert, knew his gunpowder and where to get it.
We speak softly. If God be willing, we 5 will change it.
The plotters toast Fawkes' daring plan.
A remedy to our ill. Yeah! The scene was set, and the 5 conspirators vowed to see their plot through. Winter, Percy, Wright, Catesby, and of course, Fawkes. The plan was simple, stupidly simple. They would kill the king and all his parliament and then start again, with the Catholics back in control. Sometimes the simplest plans are the best. but not always. So there is something here.
Yep, I do believe that that is it.
That's
There's
the
an
one.
explosives factory, a symbol on the gate.
Is it?
Yep,
It's a big
it is.
gate.
Bursting bomb.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, I got it. Gate.
Slow down. It's bad form to crash into explosives factory.
Sydney, I'm slightly scared. I'm in a room where they make gunpowder.
Sydney introduced me to the raw ingredients, a combination of powders unchanged since Guy Fawkes' time.
Stuff. What?
That's the saltpeter, potassium nitrate.
That's saltpeter.
That's the component that provides the oxygen, which is going to react with the carbon and the sulfur. This is the charcoal.
And that's just charcoal as I might know it?
Yes, this is the sulfur.
Do you know, it's remarkable to think, now we see them here, they're just these three really quite innocuous-looking, quite pleasant-looking powders, actually, are the basis of everything we're doing, the whole of the gunpowder plot, and all our experiment now. It's all encapsulated in these three pretty-looking powders.
They are pretty innocuous, you can eat any one.
Don't eat this stuff, man, what are you doing?
I'm seeing whether it's acidic or not, but that's a detail.
Oh, they mixed it in the barrels over there,
That's all
not
right.
in here.
That's right,
So,
wait
The three harmless ingredients only become gunpowder when they are combined together, using wooden barrels and plenty of balls. Wooden also, so they don't spark.
Once they are mixed, the material becomes potentially explosive.
Now, can I make a suggestion? Why don't we leave Alfonso to do his magical...
Not that I was scared or anything, you understand.
And we can go and put in our order for some
That will be sensible.
It just seems like a good idea.
Okay.
Incidentally, how's your Spanish? Because we need one
not very.
metric... Well, 1 metric ton of
Una
gunpowder.
tonelada métrica de polvo.
You reckon?
Because of strict controls on transporting explosives in the UK, we weren't allowed to know any more about how the gunpowder would reach our test site. All we were told was that it would turn up first thing on the day of our explosion. But at least we'd found our 17th century gunpowder, and back at base, things were also looking up.
We've taken every single concrete truck in this county to do this pour.
We needed a continuous convoy of mixers pouring without breaks to make sure the walls would set like medieval mortar.
These walls in places are 9 feet thick and full of concrete between the shuttering. It's basically where you end up if you've really fallen out with the mafia. And in our undercroft here, there's going to be 270 cubic metres of it used up. That's 650 tonnes being delivered in trucks at the moment at the rate of 1 every 12 minutes. It's a massive, massive job, and not one that anybody here has ever really done before, building the House of Lords out of concrete like this. Basically, we're trying to do what 500 years ago would have taken them, say, 11 months, in about 11 hours. It's a big job, very big.
Our concrete would need 3 weeks to set hard. For Guy Fawkes, blowing these enormous walls was going to stretch both his expertise and ingenuity. Now, according to the plotters' confessions, extracted under torture, the initial plan, using Fawkes' military expertise, was to dig under the House of Lords and fill the tunnel with gunpowder.
Hush, hush. Wait a while. Quick, away.
But digging a secret tunnel in the busiest part of Westminster was a tricky business, and noises overhead soon put a stop to it. To this day, no one knows if the tunnel was real or a later invention by the government to spice up the tale. But whatever the original plan, what happened next was almost too good to be true. The commotion they had heard was someone moving out of the undercroft that they were trying to tunnel into. It was up for lease, so co-conspirator Thomas Percy pulled some strings and rented it. Simple as that. And Fawkes knew exactly what to do with it.
30 barrels in stack under this section of the floor.
400 years ago, everybody carried things around in barrels. They were the carrier bag of the day. With gunpowder in barrels, he could put it just where he wanted, without rousing suspicion. Which is just as well, as he had 36 of them. For us, unlike Fawkes, the effects of gunpowder in barrels were a big unknown.
Now, here's the problem. No one has used gunpowder for really big bangs since the Victorians. Modern explosives are much, much more powerful, and gunpowder went out of fashion years ago. But to be safe when we do our big blow, we need to know just how powerful gunpowder is.
Sydney managed to scrape together just enough gunpowder in the UK for a one-barrel blast.
Let's go 10, this is 7. Countdown starting now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire.
Yeah, is that a bit?
Yeah.
Wow, look at that!
You can see here, you can feel, first of all, it's still warm.
Oh, yeah,
It's
it is.
not just the sun. You can smell the wonderful semi-erotic power of burnt gunpowder.
Semi-erotic. Sydney, you worry me sometimes, mate. You really do. Right.
This was the first time anyone had ever exploded a full barrel of gunpowder and measured the effect. On site, we couldn't be sure about exactly what was happening, so the test numbers were sent away to a blast prediction expert. It was time to do some serious calculations. From the number crunching, it was immediately clear that the barrel itself played a significant part in the destructive power of the blast. Now, this may sound complicated, but it's not. It's actually quite simple. Gunpowder on its own doesn't explode, it burns.
So, it starts here, it burns, and it burns through a length of time, and then at the end, it's all gone. But if you contain the gunpowder in something like a barrel, then it starts to burn here, but the barrel holds, and it burns for longer, and it's still holding all that energy, and then blam! At the end, it all lets go in one huge explosion. You've turned your burn into an explosion. Now, these barrels held on for 30% longer than the boffins expected. So that containment effect, turning your burn into an explosion. So maybe Guy Fawkes was onto something. Lots of barrels, lots of containment, and a better bang for his shilling. The experts are now truly nervous about the size of the blast. The test with one barrel surprised them. 36 barrels scares them. And if it's not safe, well, it won't happen.
Join me after the ITV News to find out how I managed to pull off Guy Fawkes' failed plot and finally carry out one of the biggest gunpowder explosions ever seen. So far on my quest to carry out Guy Fawkes' failed plot, I've found out exact details of the building Fawkes tried to blow up. Found a secret location where I can build it.
This is remote. Remote enough for what we want to do anyway, I think.
Ordered 650 tons of concrete.
It's a big job. Very big.
This is a sulphur.
I've discovered the formula for 17th century gunpowder. And I've blown one full barrel to test its power.
3, 2, 1, fire.
It was a much bigger blast than any of our experts expected.
The best thing about this experiment, but the whole reason for doing it, is that we genuinely don't know what's going to happen. Gunpowder is unpredictable stuff, and in this kind of quantity, well, who knows? But that's now become a problem because it's raised big safety issues. People are very worried. So our experts have called in another expert for some advice. He's a blast damage consultant.
He's calculated the effect that 36 barrels of gunpowder would have.
What we've been doing in our computer simulation is looking at what we think is the worst possible thing that might happen in this event, from the point of view of the safety of carrying out this experiment.
It turned out that our blast consultant's worst-case scenario was pretty scary. He'd created a virtual undercroft, complete with solid walls and every floorboard. the predictions showed some of the concrete walls and all the planks would be totally blown away.
Can you tell what velocities those planks are moving at, the ones above the explosive charge?
From this model, we've estimated that some of these boards could be travelling at 160 miles per hour, and they could reach that speed in less than 0.1 of a second.
Okay.
The virtual blast showed that if we were to set off the perfect explosion, it would be contained first by the barrels, then the walls. Its only escape was up through the floor.
I would expect bodies to go out of where the end wall is.
My guess they'd fly maybe 200 or 300 metres.
Our explosion was operating right on the permissible limits of this test site. Everything near the blast zone was at risk, and we would need to be stationed over half a mile away to be safe. With such an enormous blast, there's a question that now springs to mind: had the fuse been lit in 1605?
Would Guy Fawkes have got away? And if so, how? And where to? And how long had he got to do it? Well, by putting together a few snippets of evidence, we've come up with our own version of an escape plan. Galloping through the back streets of Old Westminster, even back then, would have been a bit OTT. So let's assume he would have walked briskly, trying not to draw attention to himself. Maybe whistling. Then he'd have got on a boat to go across the Thames, jumped on a horse, galloped down the riverbank to London Bridge to a waiting ship to take him to Flanders with news of what he'd done. So we've got walk, boat, horse, ship. How long would that have taken him? Well, we can be pretty sure he would have started from about here, underneath the throne in the House of Lords above. So, start the clock. Don't worry, I'm gonna jump. Cheers. Now, there was only one bridge over the Thames at the time, London Bridge, about 1.5 miles that way, and it was low, so that all the big ships that could sail all the way to Europe couldn't pass under it. Obviously, that would have blown the gaff a bit for Guy Fawkes, but they weren't around then. No, nothing to see. There are two other good reasons for supposing that Guy Fawkes would have crossed the river. Firstly, it would arouse less suspicion to see a man riding a horse swiftly through the fields and meadows that then made up the South Bank. Secondly, if he were being followed by a sort of sneaky beak at the time, then his boat trip would have put quite an obstacle between him and his pursuer. Of course, this was also Shakespeare's time, and this was his part of London. Some say references to the Gunpowder plot pepper the bard's later plays. In Macbeth, for instance, which was first performed a year after the traitors were caught, when the whole story just swept across the country and gripped them, he makes direct reference to the dire combustion. You didn't have those either. Today we call them f***ers. Okay. Stop the clock, because this is it. This is the site of the original bridge. His boat would have been waiting just down there, and that was not a bad time. And to be honest, it's quite a good approximation of the time it would probably have taken Guy to do the same journey. And given that time, odds are he would have used a 15-minute fuse and not a 1 hour, because it would have been much more reliable, a much better idea. So the explosion would have gone off about halfway along his route. Maybe when he was at Southwark, he'd have heard it, had time to get here, jump on that boat, catch the slack morning tide, up the Thames, sail out into the estuary, and on to Flanders. Mission accomplished.
Back at our test site, our replica House of Lords is taking shape. Once the concrete's set, the carpenters came on duty. We can't find records to confirm it, but the historians believe that the floor to the hall would be seasoned English oak. To mimic this, we're using kiln-dried pine, bolted on the side walls and uprights to give it extra strength.
What we're doing to recreate the ballistic accuracy of the project, we're using these steel frames to actually pin the joists down.
With the undercroft complete, it's time for the roof and upper walls. As we saw in our blast prediction, they won't be critical to the effects of the explosion, but we are putting them up for authenticity. Just as it was 400 years ago, it's what happens in the undercroft that will decide who is going to live and who is going to die. It's a disturbing glimpse into the mind of Fawkes, the terrorist.
Because really everything down here, these huge solid pillars, the beams, the floorboards themselves will become lethal weapons in their own right as shards and chunks of wood are accelerated to 160 miles an hour in less than a tenth of a second.
We are heading rapidly towards our moment of truth. Every move we make brings us closer to our explosion. For the plotters, everything was beginning to unravel.
Winter.
Fawkes had his own problems. The opening of Parliament had been pushed back to November, throwing his timings out. As an explosives expert, he didn't like delays. He had to keep his powder dry, literally. So he decided to take precautions and buy in more stock. But that meant more money and more risk.
Winter. It's spoiled. Where'd you find it?
Bottom of the pile.
One of the many mysteries that historians still debate to this day is the condition of the powder when it was discovered. When Fawkes was caught, his gunpowder was taken to the Tower of London, but it was recorded as being decayed. I wanted our modern-day explosives expert Sidney Alford to find out precisely what decayed meant. Would it have affected the 1605 blast?
The reason that it could have been described as decayed in a tower is that if you've got great lumps of this which have got wet and then dried, you can't pour that down a musket barrel. So, from the point of view of the infantry, that would have been decayed powder, powder you can't use. Okay, I'll fire it. 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, there we have powder that was definitely decayed. I remember how much water I poured in it to cause it to decay. You saw how it was sticking together in great lumps, but it nevertheless did go off quite vigorously. Guy Fawkes wouldn't have gone ahead with this mission at enormous personal risk if there were any doubt in his mind that the stuff wouldn't burn.
But ever the professional, Fawkes made a final trip to France for some extra fresh powder. To pay for the powder and to bankroll the rest of the plan, Catesby, the plotter's mastermind, was on a desperate search for more money. But he was about to introduce one conspirator too many.
It is but the matter of a little money!
That is all. To replace our losses. All else is made ready. So just make good your own escape. Wait until the dust has settled and my call comes. Then a new day will dawn. Our day.
The problem was that raising more money meant telling more people, more risk of betrayal. This is Francis Tresham. Some people believe that he wrote to a Catholic lord, warning him to stay away from the opening of Parliament. That letter was passed on to the authorities, causing Guy Fawkes and the whole plot to be discovered. Could this be the man who betrayed the conspirators?
Our experiment to finish what Guy Fawkes started was about to encounter a problem that we had no control over. With all test explosions, everything depends on precise timing. We had been given a small window for aircraft exclusion and military cooperation, but with the weather closing in, this was now seriously under threat.
There are two key issues with the weather. They concern cloud and wind. Firstly, cloud. It mustn't be low-lying, because if it is, that indicates possible inversions. It's all to do with wind and stuff at different levels. What you end up with, effectively, is a barrier. So the noise from the blast bounces, and it'll travel for miles cross-country and blow window panes out miles away. If that's the case, it's all off. And as you can see, it's low cloud. Secondly, the wind, it mustn't be easterly. Same problem, really. Noise and even debris going that way. And it is very much an easterly. I'm not making light of this. Seriously, 24 hours to go. Nothing we can do about this. It could all be off.
It got worse. The heavens opened, and although the roof was on, the undercroft began to leak. It was crucial that our powder was set in a dry place. The team worked through the night to seal up the chamber. After everything we'd overcome, we were now totally dependent on the weather. Last day arrived, and thankfully the rain had stopped. The final countdown on our experiment to recreate Guy Fawkes' plot was back on again. It was time to load up our House of Lords with test dummies. Purple for King James, black for the Lords, bishops in red, green for the commoners. The good, the bad and the ugly from all over the land planned to be in the chamber on November the 5th. With over 200 dignitaries in all, it was the makings of a massacre. But just who would have been there that day?
So we know a great deal about who was in here.
Absolutely. We don't know, obviously, exactly how things would have been laid out for this, because it never happened. But we know about these events before and after, so we can have a good idea.
So we've got the seat of power, the actual throne here, and then over here, presumably, we've got people wanting to get close to that power.
Here's Archbishop Bancroft. He's the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's a moderate. He doesn't really like Puritans, because they're going a bit far, but he doesn't particularly like Catholics either. If anyone's running the country, it's him. He's going to go on to be the man behind the authorised version of the Bible, the King James Bible, if he lives. OK, and here's Lord Northampton. Right. He's a really nasty character. He's going to go on to be one of Guy Fawkes' judges.
Really?
He's probably the last man in this building you would trust. He only does what's good for him.
So quite satisfyingly close to the gunpowder.
Exactly.
So basically, royals over there, bishops here, lords there. And then down here, what have we got?
Down here, you get the commons, the ordinary members of Parliament. They're gentlemen, merchants, wealthy people. A lot of them want to be sitting down there one day.
So they're kind of pressing to get closer to the influence.
Those who are hoping to do well for themselves are going to be right at the front.
Not sure his dodgy skirt's going to help, really, to be honest.
That's Francis Bacon you're talking to there.
I'm sorry.
This is one of the greatest British philosophers of all time.
Right.
The reason he's standing at the front at the moment, though, is that he likes to live very lavishly, but he's almost bankrupt, so he's hoping for a job from one of that lot down there.
So we've got a room full of MPs being pushy and seeking self-advancement.
Exactly.
Not a lot changes, really.
No.
The plotters were also entering their final day. With Fawkes in the market for fresh powder and Catesby chasing the money to pay for it, suspicion had been aroused in the alleyways of power.
You there!
On the night before the planned assassination, the Undercroft was raided.
Who speaks to these rooms?
The searches were ordered reportedly on the wisdom of the king.
They're my Lord Percy's, sir. He's laying in fuel, as you see.
To your feet!
Percy was now known to be a Catholic sympathiser.
To your feet!
the guards were tipped off what to look for.
So, you're Lord Percy's man?
I am that, my lord. John Johnson at your service.
Fawkes' alias John Johnson would not keep him safe for long. He would soon face the king and certain death. With the final preparations underway on the test site, the construction team are out and the boffins and blast engineers are in.
Now, to make sure we don't miss what happens, we have got 15 cameras covering the scene. 6 of them in this room. We don't really expect them to survive the experience. There are 3 CCTV cameras around the perimeter and 3 high-speed cameras in special explosion-proof turrets. Inside, we'll have blast gauges that'll measure the pressure on the king, the bishops, and the lords and the commoners. Outside, we'll have more blast gauges to monitor the pressure beyond the building itself. And then finally, to top it all off, hovering overhead, a helicopter with yet another camera.
Everything is set, but we're waiting for the final key ingredient.
But, right.
We finally found the gunpowder, great, in Spain, remember? We found a company that will import it for us, but it has to be in total secrecy because the amount of gunpowder...
Well, it's not going to be a big van with gunpowder written on it, is it?
They won't tell us when it's leaving or where it is in the journey, which is terrifying because we've timed everything to happen and we need to know.
But surely you can tell me when, because if I don't know...
By 8 o'clock, otherwise the whole thing's off.
Well, it's supposed to be delivered at 8 o'clock, and it's 20 past 8 now, and it isn't here.
The gunpowder finally turned up. 1 metric ton in an unmarked truck that, for security reasons, we could not film.
And they're now very carefully loading it into the barrels. And from this point on, things get very, very strict. Only people who absolutely need to be here can come in. We can't even use lights in here. That's why we're filming using this strange night vision stuff.
Any spark could cause the whole lot to go off. Everything has suddenly got very real.
This is a strange moment, because Guy Fawkes did exactly this 400 years ago. Same amount of gunpowder, same number of barrels, in the same place, directly under the throne and the chamber above. Found out so much about the man and what drove him to try and do this terrible thing. I feel like I know him. But this is as far as history takes me. From here on, it's into the unknown. And it's time to go.
Speed out on all stations. There'll be a large explosion at the Atlantica test site for the next 5 minutes. All aircraft are to avoid.
Stand by for broadcast, stand by for broadcast. There'll be a large explosion within the next 3 minutes.
$650 tons of concrete, 1 ton of gunpowder, 1 building and 1 very, very big experiment. Well, the exclusion zone is in place. We're all here waiting. The building is there with the gunpowder. The weather is with us. It's time to do it. At last, we were about to find out what would have happened if Guy Fawkes had lit his gunpowder 400 years ago. Would his murderous plot have worked?
What do you think?
Killed him.
That was big. That was...
They don't make them like that anymore.
Nothing in the breeze.
No, I wish we could smell it. Yes, look.
Yeah,
See that
yeah,
debris? There's debris still coming down.
Enormous. That was much bigger than I expected.
Really?
It's still coming down.
The remains of the test dummies were an eerie vision of what could have been.
Oh, that's terribly... Oh, it's all over. It's strange. I know it was an experiment. We know it wasn't for real. In one sense, it was a real explosion. But it does feel gruesome. It really does. This wall was clear. It was gone. Look at this whole end section. That's 7 foot thick, and it's just pushed. It's done the same on the other side. It's just shoved it out of the way, and this back wall, which we thought might be broached, is gone. The king was. Yeah, that's what you said. Hang on, the king was about there. And he's very much not there now. The fence was gone.
And not many of his friends around either.
Well, look, I mean, there's half a tapestry hanging off the glass wall at the back. Where is the king?
It was a charge intended to do a specific job within those 4 substantial walls, and it's done it. The damage done by bits going up in the air would have been psychologically very impressive. Remember, these bits of plastic would have been body parts.
The thing that's really astonished me is the way the end wall has just been completely blasted out of the building, and the side walls just pushed apart by the force of the explosion. You see they just slid across the pad. Absolutely extraordinary. Just the energy in that explosion was really something. The overall impression you get is just such destructive power. The speed that everything took off on the floor must have been, well, I mean, you know, we had this estimate 160 miles an hour. It looked, all of that. Bodies themselves, even before you get thrown that distance, the acceleration on somebody standing on the floor would have been just so enormous that, you know, their skeleton would have been shattered, I think. As an assassin, he would have achieved exactly what he'd set out to do.
Further calculations that our blast experts made for us show Fawkes had allowed for at least 50% of the gunpowder not going off. That means if he'd only used half the charge, it would have had the same devastating effect, killing every soul in the building.
Look, that is purple. That is, isn't it? That's the king.
The king was purple, wasn't he? Yeah.
You reckon that's his...
Top of his head, isn't it?
That is the top of the king's head. So, I mean, we knew, it was obvious when you saw it, he'd got the king, but, I mean, there's absolute proof.
Will that work?
It worked. I mean, it worked. Having seen that and been amazed and surprised by the ferocity of it and the extent of the destruction, I don't think there's any doubt. If Guy Fawkes had lit that fuse, he would have changed the course of history.
It was just after midnight on November the 5th. Fawkes was caught carrying a match and the fuse, but steadfastly maintained his alias and alibi. King James was woken to face his would-be assassin.
So just who might you be, sir?
I'm John Johnson. I'm my Lord Percy's man.
And you would kill your king in Parliament?
No true king. But I would thee.
But you see, God has protected us from your hideous treason.
Not God, sir. But the devil.
And the children of the blood? The little children? And all those other souls who never in the least offended thee. You would suffer their deaths.
A dangerous disease. Requires a desperate remedy.
The game was now up, and even though Guy insisted he was working alone, James knew how to break him. A short and bloody future now awaited Fawkes. First, torture to get the names of his conspirators, and then the worst form of public execution that the state could invent. He would be hanged until half dead, disemboweled and beheaded, and then his corpse hacked into pieces.
Within days, the rest of the conspirators were either dead or awaiting trial and execution. James I ordered bonfires to be lit across the land to celebrate the deliverance from evil.
Now that the dust has settled, I've come back to Westminster to answer the question I began with. Would the gunpowder plot have worked? Well, the answer is a very big yes, obviously. Nobody in the House of Lords that day would have survived. Even our blast gauges that we put in there to measure the power of the explosion didn't make it. They went right off the scale and then expired.
But what damage would the blast have caused 400 years ago in the lanes of Old Westminster?
Pieces of King James, his lords, bishops and parliamentarians would have been spattered over a gruesome 100 metres. This is the exact spot where we found the king's skull after our experiment. At 100 to 200 metres away, we're still close enough for the buildings to be damaged. So say goodbye to your windows for a start, if you could afford them. There'd be no stained glass left in Westminster Abbey. And if you were near those windows when they shattered, well, you'd be pretty badly cut up.
At 400 metres, there would still be some broken windows and a rain of debris, mainly roof tiles and timbers, and lots of smoke. The sound of the huge blast would be heard at least 5 miles away. But what of the effect of the explosion on the nation? Would the dream that Catesby, Fawkes and the other plotters had of a Catholic country have followed their mass assassination?
The least likely is that it worked perfectly. We get a new Catholic monarchy, Catesby and his friends are in power. So then our history might have gone more like France's.
So there wouldn't have been a royal family here in London, all different?
The president would be living in Buckingham Palace. By far the more likely possibility is that they would have all been arrested and executed, just as they were anyway. Something like 5% of the population were Catholic. There would have been a massacre, and there'd be no Catholics left in Britain at all.
So really then, whether or not the gunpowder went off, it was never going to work.
It could never have worked. It was a stupid plan. You can't change the politics of a whole country just by blowing up a few hundred people.
One last thought. This is the largest rocket you can buy in the shop. It's got 50 grams of gunpowder in it. Guy Fawkes had 20,000 times this much for his November the 5th fireworks. The irony is, we light these to mark a blast that never happened. Sorry, London.